Welcome to my channel. Tonight's story takes us deep into the shadows of 1856 Natchez, where wealth, power, and respectability hid a secret so dark it shattered an entire aristocratic society. This is the true and chilling account of one enslaved boy, young, unheard, and underestimated, whose courage exposed 56 of the most powerful men in the city and brought their empire of silence crashing down. As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on real historical records, court documents, and painstaking research, please subscribe, because uncovering the truth behind forgotten history takes time, effort, and relentless fact-finding. In 1856, Natchez, Mississippi stood as one of the richest cities in the American South, a place where towering mansions overlooked the Mississippi River and cotton money flowed endlessly into the pockets of elite white families. On the surface, it was a symbol of Southern elegance, lavish balls, polished silver, imported furniture, and powerful surnames that commanded instant respect. But beneath this polished image existed a carefully maintained silence, one that protected the city's wealth and its most influential men. This wealth was built almost entirely on slavery. Enslaved people worked the cotton fields, served inside grand homes, and lived under constant surveillance and fear. Their voices carried no legal weight, their suffering dismissed as property disputes rather than human cruelty. Natchez's aristocracy depended on this imbalance. Silence was not accidental, it was enforced. Speaking out meant punishment, separation from family, or death. The legal system, churches, and social institutions all played a role in maintaining this quiet. Judges, lawyers, politicians, and plantation owners often belonged to the same families or social circles, ensuring that accusations, especially those made by enslaved people, never reached daylight. Rumors were buried, witnesses were ignored, and crimes were quietly erased to protect reputations. By 1856, this culture of silence had become the true foundation of Natchez's power. It allowed horrific acts to continue unchecked and gave aristocrats confidence that nothing, no matter how dark, would ever threaten them. That is why what happened next was unthinkable. A single enslaved boy would break that silence, exposing how fragile this carefully constructed world truly was. He was young, enslaved, and legally invisible, born into a world where his words held no value and his pain carried no consequence. In 1856, Natchez, an enslaved boy, was expected to obey, endure, and remain silent. Children like him were treated not as human beings, but as property, taught early that speaking the truth could invite brutal punishment. His name, like so many others, was barely recorded because history rarely cared to preserve the identities of enslaved children. This boy moved quietly through spaces where secrets lived, plantation houses, back rooms, private gatherings of powerful men. Because he was enslaved and a child, he was ignored, underestimated, and unseen. Aristocrats spoke freely around him, believing his presence harmless. They never imagined that someone society considered voiceless could become the most dangerous witness of all. When the boy tried to speak, no one listened. His early attempts to tell what he had seen and endured were dismissed as lies, imagination, or insolence. Enslaved testimony was routinely rejected in courts, and the word of a child held even less weight. Masters, overseers, and local authorities chose comfort over truth, preserving their social order by refusing to hear him. But silence does not erase truth, it only delays it. The boy remembered everything: faces, locations, patterns, and acts meant to stay hidden forever. Each ignored plea strengthened his resolve. What made him powerful was not status or protection, but memory. And in a society built on the belief that he would never be heard, That memory would become the weapon that no aristocrat could escape. Behind the grand facades of Natchez's mansions existed an unspoken alliance among the city's most powerful families. These were not just wealthy plantation owners, but judges, lawyers, merchants, and politicians, men whose influence extended into every corner of society. Their power did not rely solely on money. It depended on loyalty, shared secrets, and mutual protection. What one man did in private, others quietly defended in public. This network functioned like a closed circle. Marriages tied families together, business partnerships strengthened trust, and social gatherings became places where boundaries disappeared. Within this protected world, certain crimes were treated as privileges. Acts that would destroy ordinary people were quietly forgiven among elites. If rumors surfaced, they were smothered with bribes, threats, or favors exchanged behind closed doors. Enslaved people were central to this system, not as humans, but as tools of secrecy. They were forced to serve at private gatherings, escort guests, clean rooms, and witness acts they were never meant to survive speaking about. The aristocrats relied on the law's refusal to recognize enslaved testimony, confident that no accusation could touch them. The system was so secure that even the men involved believed themselves untouchable. What made this network dangerous was its scale. It wasn't one household or one offender, it was dozens of respected names, all bound together by shared guilt. To expose one meant risking the collapse of all. That is why, when a single enslaved boy began to speak truths that connected these men, the threat was not just scandal, it was total destruction of Natchez's ruling class. In 1856 Natchez, respectability was the strongest disguise of all. The men at the center of this story were publicly celebrated as pillars of society, church leaders, benefactors, judges, and refined gentlemen whose names appeared in newspapers with admiration. Their polished manners, expensive suits, and family reputations created a shield that few dared to question. To accuse such men was to challenge the very identity of Natchez itself. Behind closed doors, however, respectability became a mask for cruelty and abuse. Private rooms, guest houses, and plantation quarters turned into places where laws no longer applied. Crimes committed against enslaved people were dismissed as discipline, rumor, or property matters. The social class of the accused mattered more than the suffering of the victims. Wealth turned brutality into misunderstanding, and power transformed violence into silence. Churches and courts often reinforced this illusion. Sermons spoke of morality while ignoring the horrors happening within congregants' homes. Legal authorities hesitated to investigate anyone with influence, fearing backlash, loss of position, or exposure of their own involvement. Even when whispers circulated, they were framed as jealousy or lies spread by those who knew their place. This false respectability allowed evil to thrive in plain sight. The city trusted appearances more than truth, manners more than morality. And that is what made the eventual exposure so devastating, because when the mask finally cracked, it revealed that the most honorable men in Natchez had been hiding the darkest crimes of all. At first, the truth moved quietly. No announcements, no headlines, just whispers. In a city like Natchez, rumors traveled through kitchens, slave quarters, back alleys, and carriage rides long before they ever reached official ears. Enslaved people spoke in hushed voices at night, sharing fragments of stories they were too afraid to say aloud during the day. They knew which houses to avoid, which men were dangerous, and which doors hid secrets no one dared name. Among white residents, the whispers sounded different. Some heard things and chose to look away. Others sensed that something was deeply wrong, but feared what acknowledging it would mean. Questioning powerful families could cost business, friendships, or social standing. So the rumors were passed carefully, never written, never spoken too clearly, always wrapped in doubt. It's probably not true, people would say, even as the same stories resurfaced again and again. The enslaved boy's words became part of these whispers. Pieces of his testimony leaked from one person to another, slowly forming a pattern too consistent to ignore. What frightened the aristocracy was not just that rumors existed, but that they were aligning. Different people, different places, the same names. Silence was no longer fully under their control. By the time the whispers reached the wider public, Natchez felt uneasy. Trust began to fracture. Doors closed earlier. Conversations stopped when certain men entered a room. The city sensed that something buried was trying to surface, and once whispers reach that stage, they are no longer rumors. They are warnings. The breaking point came when silence could no longer contain what had been hidden for years. What began as whispers suddenly demanded answers, and the enslaved boy's testimony, once ignored, could no longer be dismissed. Details he shared matched too many rumors, too many locations, too many powerful names. For the first time, the stories aligned so clearly that denial became impossible. Natchez stood at the edge of exposure. Authorities who had long looked away were forced to listen, not out of justice, but out of fear. The scale of the accusations threatened public order. If the truth stayed buried, it risked erupting violently. If it surfaced, it would shatter the city's elite. Either way, control was slipping. The boy was questioned again, this time carefully, quietly, and in secret, his words recorded instead of laughed at. As investigators followed his account, evidence appeared where none was expected. Witnesses who had stayed silent began to speak, encouraged by the realization that they were not alone. Patterns emerged, shared locations, repeated behaviors, familiar names crossing household lines. Each confirmation tightened the noose around men who had believed themselves untouchable. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It came as an avalanche. One statement led to another, and the silence that had protected Natchez's aristocracy collapsed under the weight of its own lies. In that moment, power shifted. The city realized that the most dangerous thing to fear was not rebellion or rumor, but truth spoken at last. When the case finally reached the courts, Natchez witnessed something it had never seen before. Courtrooms, once reserved for protecting the elite, began to echo with the names of the city's most respected men. Plantation owners, businessmen, legal figures, and heirs to powerful families were no longer spoken of in admiration, but in accusation. Each name read aloud struck like a blow to the city's carefully preserved image. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense and unnatural. Judges and lawyers found themselves facing men they dined with, worshipped beside, and relied upon for influence. Some proceedings were delayed, others intentionally complicated, as the system struggled to prosecute those it was designed to protect. Still, the sheer number of accused made quiet dismissal impossible. This was not a single scandal. It was a web of corruption too large to hide. The enslaved boy's testimony stood at the center of it all. Though the law resisted granting him full credibility, the consistency of his account and the supporting evidence forced the court to listen. Witnesses corroborated details, and records connected households that should never have been linked. The truth dragged respectability into the open, where titles and wealth offered no immediate shelter. Outside the courtroom, the city watched in disbelief. Families locked their doors, alliances fractured, and reputations crumbled in real time. Natchez's legal halls, once symbols of order and authority, became stages where power was questioned, and where the myth of aristocratic innocence finally began to die. As news of the trials spread, Natchez fell into a state of collective shock. People struggled to reconcile the accusations with the men they thought they knew, the gentlemen who hosted dinners, led prayers, and represented the city's pride. Conversations in public spaces grew cautious, voices lowered, and familiar names were spoken only in whispers. The idea that so many respected figures could be implicated at once shattered the illusion of moral superiority that Natchez had long relied on. In private, fear replaced disbelief. Families connected to the accused worried about what might surface next: letters, witnesses, or confessions that could widen the scandal even further. Some destroyed documents, others fled the city temporarily, and a few attempted to use remaining influence to halt proceedings. The fear was not just of punishment, but of exposure. Reputation in Natchez was everything, and once lost, it could never be rebuilt. For enslaved people and marginalized residents, the shock carried a different meaning. There was fear of retaliation, but also a quiet, dangerous hope. For the first time, powerful men appeared vulnerable. The unthinkable had happened. The city was listening. Still, hope remained fragile, knowing how easily justice could reverse itself when power regained control. Natchez existed in two emotional worlds at once: public disbelief and private terror. Smiles in the streets hid panic behind closed doors. The city understood that it was living through a moment that could never be undone, and whatever the outcome, Natchez would never be the same again. One by one, the untouchable began to fall. What made this moment unprecedented was not just a single conviction or public disgrace, but the sheer number of powerful men dragged into the collapse. 56 members of Natchez's aristocracy were exposed, their names forever tied to scandal, investigation, and moral ruin. A social class that had ruled unquestioned for generations suddenly found itself stripped of credibility. Some faced formal charges, others lost titles, wealth, or political influence. Even those who avoided prison could not escape consequences. Business partnerships dissolved overnight, families were ostracized, and once respected surnames became symbols of shame. In a society built on honor and appearance, public exposure was a punishment as devastating as any sentence. The legal system, overwhelmed by the scale of the case, could not deliver equal justice to all. Some elites used remaining influence to reduce penalties or disappear quietly from Natchez. Yet escape did not mean survival. Their social power was broken. Doors that once opened freely now closed. Invitations stopped. Trust vanished. What made their fall so profound was its source. It was not a rival aristocrat, a political enemy, or an outside force. It was an enslaved boy the system believed incapable of truth. His words dismantled an empire of privilege, proving that even the strongest structures collapse when built on lies. Natchez's ruling class learned, too late, that silence is not strength, and truth, once unleashed, cannot be controlled. After the shock faded and the city began to regain its balance, a new effort quietly took shape, erasing the memory of what had happened. Natchez's leaders understood that the scandal threatened not just individuals, but the city's legacy. If future generations learned the full truth, the image of Southern honor and aristocratic dignity would be permanently stained. So history itself became the next battlefield. Records were minimized, misfiled, or left deliberately vague. Newspaper reports softened language, avoided details, or shifted blame away from respected families. Some accounts vanished entirely, surviving only in fragments of court documents and private letters. The enslaved boy's role was especially diminished. His testimony summarized briefly, his suffering reduced to footnotes, his identity nearly erased. Over time, the story was reframed. What had been a massive exposure of elite corruption was recast as isolated incidents or unfortunate rumors exaggerated by unrest. Textbooks ignored it. Local histories skipped over it. Natchez's grand homes remained tourist attractions, while the crimes committed within their walls went unspoken. But buried history never stays buried forever. Traces remained in inconsistencies, forgotten files, and unanswered questions. Each rediscovered document challenged the silence once again. The attempt to erase the case became proof of its importance, showing that the truth was so dangerous it had to be hidden, not because it was false, but because it was devastatingly real. At the heart of this case was a brutal truth: justice in 1856 Natchez was never meant to be equal. Race determined whose voice mattered, whose pain counted, and whose life could be sacrificed to protect power. Even as the scandal unfolded, the legal system bent under the weight of prejudice, struggling to accept that an enslaved boy, someone considered property, could be the key witness in the destruction of white aristocrats. The boy's testimony, though crucial, was constantly questioned, filtered, and controlled. He was not treated as a victim seeking justice, but as a tool used only when convenient. His safety was never guaranteed, his trauma never centered. Meanwhile, the accused, despite overwhelming evidence, were granted protections, delays, and legal strategies designed to soften consequences. Justice, when it appeared, arrived incomplete and unequal. For other enslaved people, the message was clear. Speaking the truth was dangerous, and even when truth succeeded, it came at a high cost. Retaliation, punishment, and renewed control followed the exposure. The system allowed limited accountability for elites while preserving the larger structure of racial oppression that made such crimes possible in the first place. This case revealed the deepest injustice of all. Even when the truth was proven true, justice remained out of reach. The fall of powerful men did not mean freedom or protection for the oppressed. It showed how a racist system could acknowledge wrongdoing without ever surrendering its power, and how survival itself became an act of resistance for those denied justice. This story does not end in 1856. It echoes into the present. The dark secret of Natchez matters today because it exposes how power protects itself, how truth is delayed, and how the voices of the powerless are often ignored until damage becomes unavoidable. The enslaved boy's courage forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. History is not just what happened, but what was allowed to be remembered. The case reveals patterns that still exist: institutions shielding the powerful, victims being doubted, and reputations valued more than human lives. When societies choose comfort over accountability, injustice repeats itself under new names and modern disguises. Natchez is not an isolated story. It is a warning about what happens when silence becomes tradition. Remembering this secret restores dignity to those erased from history. It shifts focus away from the grandeur of mansions and famous families and toward the lives harmed within those walls. By telling this story, the enslaved boy is no longer invisible. He becomes a symbol of truth that survived deliberate forgetting. This secret matters because confronting it changes how we understand justice, memory, and responsibility. Only by acknowledging buried truths can history stop being a weapon of silence and become a tool for awareness. What was once hidden now demands to be remembered, so that silence never wins again.